My name is Sean O'Brien, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights here on campus. And it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the afternoon panel and to what has been another well-organized and very engaging conference by the Center for Ethics and Culture. Our panel this afternoon is entitled Pope Francis and the Preferential Option for the Poor. The preferential option for the poor has been embraced by some, denigrated by a few, and perhaps misunderstood by many. Here to help at least some of us move out of that latter category are two speakers well known and beloved to many of you here in this room here at Notre Dame. Thomas D. Williams is a theologian, author, and consultant, and an international speaker. He holds degrees in theology, philosophy, and business administration, as well as a diploma in languages and classical humanities. He taught theology and social ethics for more than a decade at the Regina Apostolorum Pontifical Athenaeum in Rome. The hardest part of my day is over now after pronouncing that. All right, I can relax now, yeah. Where he served as dean of the theology school for 7 years. He's also taught and lectured in Ireland, Poland, Peru, Venezuela, Spain, Mexico, Switzerland, Germany, Cote d'Ivoire, and the United States. Williams was ordained a Catholic priest in 1994 with the Legionaries of Christ and granted a dispensation by the Holy See in order to marry in the Church. Williams was appointed by the Holy See as Vatican spokesperson for the 1997 Synod for America and the 2001 Synod for the Role of Bishops. And he's published 15 books and numerous articles and essays on a broad variety of topics, from Catholic social thought to Christian spirituality to the new atheism. Michael Baxter teaches theology and ethics in the Catholic Studies Department at DePaul University in Chicago. Before that, he taught at Notre Dame for 15 years, and well known to many of you in this room. He received a PhD in theology and ethics at Duke University, and has published articles in Communio, Pro Ecclesia, The Thomist, and the DePaul Law Review. He is currently working on a book of essays towards a counter-tradition of Catholic social ethics in the United States. He was also co-founder of Andre House in Phoenix, and lived and worked in the Catholic worker community here in South Bend from 2003 to 2009. We have drawn straws, and Professor Williams will go first. He'll have 30 minutes, followed by Professor Baxter. And after that, we should have time for question and answer. So thank you for being here. And with that, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I suffered a little bit of an attack of gremlins who hit my computer and destroyed my talk. So I've reconstructed it, and as someone reminded me, it'll probably come out better this way than if you had read the paper that you had prepared, which is undoubtedly true. I'm also going to break the golden rule and do unto you what I would not want done to myself, which is I'm going to speak in a more narrative tone than I usually would in a paper like this. It's going to be, if you will, chronological and personal in my relationship with the preferential option for the poor and how that's developed and how what were kind of the highlights along the way that gave me new insights into the substance and the importance of this principle. So the first chapter of the 5 chapters that I'm going to briefly go through was my first meeting with the principle of preferential option for the poor. It was not a happy encounter. It was not a warm and cuddly experience. I first heard of this principle in 1985. 1985 stands right between two very important documents from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, both on liberation theology. The one that came out in 1984 was called Libertatis Nuncius, and the one that came out in 1986, Libertatis Conscientia. And these are two documents that basically criticized and took apart the liberation theology that was in vogue at that time. Very strongly worded, and when they refer to the preferential option of the poor, as both of these documents do, they're basically describing the limitations that one must put on this principle to understand it in a Catholic way. So everything was rather negative in that first encounter, and I was very skeptical about this principle. When I would hear people speak about the preferential option for the poor in those days, I would think, oh yeah, that's that semi-heretical principle that is used and that supports the Sandinistas and all these other different things that were happening. And that was about my knowledge of it. The way Libertatis Conscientiae describes its purpose in the introduction to that document is the following. This instruction has a limited and precise purpose to draw the attention of pastors, theologians, and all the faithful to the deviations and risks of deviation, damaging to the faith and to Christian living, that are brought about by certain forms of liberation theology, which use in an insufficiently critical manner concepts borrowed from various currents of Marxist thought. Not, let's all get on the bus, right? And it goes on to say, the theologies of liberation, which reserve credit for restoring to a place of honor the great texts of the prophets and of the gospel in defense of the poor, go on to a disastrous confusion between the poor of the scriptures and the proletariat of Marx. In this way, they pervert the Christian meaning of the poor, and they transform the fight for the rights of the poor into a class fight within the ideological perspectives of the class struggle. So this document, these two documents, when they speak of the preferential option, they do so in a limiting way. They say, this is not to be thought of as exclusive. This is not to be thought of as a social category of class. This is not to be thought of in an opposition or a dialectic framework of the oppressed and the oppressor. Everything there in these documents is to limit this and say it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. And at the time, I was very taken with this criticism, which later on when I would read some of the texts of liberation theologians, I saw that their critique was not unjust. There are plenty of elements in there that completely substantiate, if not the tone, certainly the substance of what came out in these documents from the CDF. And as I went on to study, after this time, study philosophy and to pay particular interest to justice, I thought to myself, too, that the preferential option was a denial of the most basic standards of justice, which is equality. Even in the Old Testament, which has numerous texts in favor of the poor, we read that a poor person you shall not favor in his dispute, nor the rich in theirs. In other words, that before the law, you should not pay attention to the one you have in front of you. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter came in 1992. I was studying a graduate seminar on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics with a priest whom some of you know here. He pays visits to this esteemed university, Father Kevin Flannery. And in the course of that, when we were studying chapter 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics on Justice, we read the things that we typically know, that the person doesn't matter, that justice is objective, it's impartial. You remember old representations of the goddess Justice. You can all picture, because they're all over the place, either in statues or in artistic images, and you will see a woman holding in her hand scales. In her other hand, either a sword of justice or sometimes a cornucopia of goods, signifying either punishment or doling out these benefits, and importantly, wearing a blindfold. And the blindfold, the image of the blindfold on justice is that before the law, it doesn't matter who you are, that everything will be applied with partiality. And we hold this principle in great esteem, particularly in our country. So Aristotle says, and I read, it makes no difference whether a good man has defrauded a bad man or a bad man a good one, nor whether it is a good or a bad man that has committed adultery. The law looks only to the distinctive character of the injury and treats the parties as equal. So this is Aristotle talking about commutative justice in chapter 5. But then he goes on to describe distributive justice, another form of particular justice, and said things that got me thinking in a different vein. He said, one kind of particular justice is that which is manifested in distribution of honor or money or the other things that fall to be divided among those who have a share in the Constitution. For in these it's possible for one man to have a share either unequal or equal to that of another. And here Aristotle introduces a key element, which is that of subjectivity. That in certain applications of justice, particularly distributive justice, the subject does matter. Suddenly the person is there before us. We rip off the blindfold off justice, and we pay attention to the one we have before us. And he says that this form of justice is no longer an arithmetic justice. I borrow $100, I pay $100 back. This is what he calls a geometric proportion, that what you receive should be proportional to who you are. And how does he describe this? How do we determine who gets more and who gets less in Aristotle's distributive justice? And I quote again from chapter 5, "The same equality will exist between the persons and between the things concerned. For as the latter, the things concerned, are related, so are the former. If they're not equal, they will not have what is equal. But this is the origin of quarrels and complaints, when either equals have and are awarded unequal shares, or unequals equal shares." So Aristotle introduces this idea that not everyone is equal, which is strange and which definitely clashes with our understanding of what it means to be a citizen. And he goes on and says, further, this is plain from the fact that awards should be according to merit. For all men agree that what is just in distribution must be according to merit in some sense, though they do not all specify the same sort of merit. Democrats identify it with the status of free men, supporters of oligarchy with wealth or with noble birth, and supporters of aristocracy with excellence. So Aristotle introduces this idea of subjectivity in distribution of justice. Thomas Aquinas later on, both in his Summa and in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, takes this and basically underscores this question of merit. He talks about the importance or prominence in the community. But Aquinas, importantly, doesn't get to the substance of it either. And he repeats what Aristotle says, there are different ways of gauging this. And he repeats, in a democracy this, in an oligarchy this, in another thing this. And I remember on studying this, starting to think, well, I wonder if it's possible from a Christian perspective to bring up another criterion of merit, of desert. I wonder whether the idea of need, poverty in the broad sense of vulnerability and dependence, could possibly be a sufficient category to merit more in the eyes of justice. Chapter 3, 1994. A few of us were having dinner in 1994 with Cardinal Jaime Sin, who used to be the Archbishop of Manila and is responsible for putting together one of the largest aggregations of human beings ever known. When he, when Pope John Paul II visited, the Cardinal Archbishop of Manila canceled all the Sunday Masses in the entire archdiocese, would not allow any of the priests to celebrate Mass at their parishes, basically forcing everyone in the diocese to go to the Pope's Mass. And by doing so, he got close to 5 million people there for quite a turnout. Cardinal Jaime Sin has a great personality. He was a very jocular individual. And at one point during the meal, he started talking about his family life when he was growing up. And he said, well, I was one of 16 children. We had a very large family in the Philippines. And of those 16, I was always the favorite. And everybody laughed. And then he said, because I was the ugliest. I was my mother's favorite because I was the ugliest. And everybody laughed some more, and we went on with the dinner. And the next day, I don't know why that idea that he had said that he was the favorite because he was the ugliest I kept turning it over in my mind. Because a family, as we know from Catholic social doctrine, is the paradigm of society. It is the first natural society. From the family, we understand principles like the common good, like subsidiarity, like solidarity. We find them in microcosm in the family, and from that, we're able to apply them to larger societies. We can understand what they are. And Cardinal Sin, he makes a lot of jokes, he used to make a lot of jokes about that name. Cardinal Sin brought up a very important point that in a family, naturally, the one who is most needy, or ugliest in his words, receives a disproportionate amount of care. Not only from the parents, although they in the first place, but also from the other siblings. And it's understood to be a natural thing. This preferential option for the poorest in a family is a spontaneous occurrence. Many of you know I have a son with Down syndrome, very severe Down syndrome, and he is the center of the family, and it could not be any other way. And it's understood that that's the way things are and the way that things should be. And you find here that in this distributive justice, if you will, from parents and family, it's not only about distribution of money. I think that part of our diffidence sometimes toward the idea of distribution is that we always go immediately to the idea of the state and doling out money and redistributing wealth and things which all have their place, but that's not really at the core of what distributive justice is about. Even Aristotle talks about the giving of honors and goods and things. It goes a lot beyond that. It has to do with things that are distributable, things that are allotted. And in the case of a family, the most precious and least elastic of all, even less elastic than, least inelastic. Money can always be made. It's never completely limited. What is completely limited and inelastic is time. The way we dole out time and attention is something which we cannot make more of, and something which truly does show this preferential option in terms of the time and the attention that is given. And this became, for me, very important, both for understanding the preferential option for the poor and understanding Catholic social doctrine as a science, as a discipline on its own. Jump forward now to 2001, which was the year I began teaching Catholic social doctrine. And I found that those initial documents that I had read by the CDF, which speak about limiting and clarifying aspects of the preferential option that could be considered as problematic, I found a very rich tradition that preceded the coining of the phrase preferential option of the poor by Gustavo Gutierrez in 1967, and go back at least as far, if we're not talking about biblical roots, at least as far in Catholic social teaching as to Leo XIII. In 1891, in Rerum Novarum, he says some very, very interesting things that are really at the core of what we understand by the preferential option for the poor. He says, the laws and judgments of men must yield place to the laws and judgments of Christ, the true God, who said, as long as you did it to one of these least brethren, you did it to me. And he goes on to talk about, without using the term distributive justice, he gets to the core of exactly what distributive justice is. Whoever has received from the divine bounty a large share of temporal blessings, whether they be external and material or gifts of the mind, has received them for the purpose of using them for the perfecting of his own nature, and at the same time that he may employ them as the steward of God's providence for the benefit of others. All of us are dispensers of distributive justice. It's not something that is only the political authority that practices the virtue of distributive justice. All of us do, because all of us have goods and talents and qualities that go beyond our immediate needs and that we administer as stewards for the good of the community. All of us make choices about how we are going to develop them and how we are going to allot them to others. Leo also said, when there's a question of defending the rights of individuals, the poor and badly off have a claim to a special consideration. The richer class have many ways of shielding themselves and stand less in need of help from the state, whereas the mass of the poor have no resources of their own to fall back upon and must chiefly depend upon the assistance of the state. And it is for this reason that wage earners, since they mostly belong to the mass of the needy, should be specially cared for and protected by the government. I'm not going to go through, because first of all, I didn't have time to collect them all again, but also I think it's unnecessary with this particularly august crowd to go through the teaching of the Second Vatican Council and John the 23rd and Paul VI and John Paul II, all of whom either expressly or implicitly invoke the preferential option for the poor. But I began to realize that this was something much more essential and central to our teaching than what it seemed like in my first encounter. Which brings us to 2013. Pope Francis. Pope Francis has been badly misinterpreted and badly misjudged, not only by his critics, but by his fans as well. Many people presume to speak for Francis, thinking that after hearing a couple lines that he's uttered in different places, that they know him, and that they know what he thinks about everything, because he's either just like me or he's not like me. And they attribute to him many different things that he has never said, and as far as I can tell, has never thought. What he has done since the outset of his pontificate is set a seal on it that it will be a pontificate of the poor and for the poor. And what he clearly and explicitly is trying to do is to put attention to the poor and the needy at the core of who we are as a church and who we are as Christians. And in doing so, he is taking his marching orders directly, as far as I can tell, from the gospel. Many of the things that people are either up in arms over or applauding are things that are simply a very similar path, especially in terms of emphases, to that we find in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the life of Jesus. The people who are most uncomfortable are probably people like you and me. People who have a danger or risk of becoming complacent, feeling like we might have our doctrine in order, feeling like we have a place at the table. And Francis is shaking that up a little bit, asking us to do more, asking us to do things that we're not so comfortable with. And that was the story of Jesus' life. The people that he was hardest on were the people that were more religious and people who were more professionally pious and people who had a stake in that. And he didn't do that in order to turn them away. He did that in order to challenge them and shake them out of that complacency. And the people that were most affectionate and overjoyed to the mission of Jesus were people who were disenfranchised, people who felt like there was no place for them and were not really sure whether God loved them or not. And Jesus, through his conduct and through his words, assured them that indeed he did love them. And that is what Francis is about. Francis definitely has downplayed doctrine, not because he doesn't consider it important, but because, first of all, we've had a series of eminent popes who have done a fantastic job of clarifying and articulating Catholic doctrine. We understand what the Church teaches on a number of issues. Anyone who doesn't has been hiding under a rock for a good many years. There's no question of what that is, and merely repeating that is not going to bring more people into the churches. It's not going to make people understand or love the church more, understand more the mercy and the love that God has for them. And Francis has chosen to devote his attention and to invite all Christians to devote their attention to that common task. In his invocation, both again explicitly and implicitly, of the preferential option for the poor, he first invokes continuity. In Evangelii Gaudium, the apostolic exhortation from last year, where he speaks most extensively about this, the first person he quotes is a big, long quote from Benedict XVI. I mean, every chance he gets, he quotes Benedict. He's always talking about this continuity between the two, despite the fact that many in the media would like to separate them as antagonistic. He has done everything in his power to show that that's not the case. A second thing that he, and I wouldn't so much as call these changes as shifts in emphasis and also differences in tone in the way he articulates some of these, that the poor are truly our greatest treasure, that they're at the center of the church. And this brings us back to our discussion earlier on distributive justice, that idea of prominence in society or importance. Francis truly believes that the poor are important for us, that they have something to give that no one else can give, that we have a lot to learn from them. And it couldn't help reminding me, as I was preparing these reflections, on that very well-known case of the Deacon Lawrence in the early church, when the prefect of Rome arrested Deacon Lawrence, who was in charge of the church treasury and distributing the money to the poor. He told him that he wanted all the church's treasures. So Lawrence asked for 3 days to be able to collect all the treasures in order to bring them to the Roman prefect and turn them in. And what Deacon Lawrence did for those 3 days was distribute as much of the coffers as he could to the poor, and then he brought in a group of poor and crippled and blind people presented him before the prefect and said, "These are our treasure." He said, "This is the wealth of the church. This is what we have." And obviously, that did not go over awfully well with the prefect of Rome, and Lawrence found himself baking before long on the grill. Francis is far from condescending in his instruction on how we are to deal with the poor, how we are to love the poor. The poor teach us, he says. They evangelize us. Don't look at them as if you are doing them some great favor from your high and mighty peak. He says, and I quote, "The poor have much to teach us. Not only do they share in the sensus fidei, but in their difficulties, they know the suffering Christ. We need to let ourselves be evangelized by them. We are called to find Christ in them, to lend our voice to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them." He really considers the poor, and by poor, again, he's not talking about a social class. He is talking about the vulnerable, the suffering. Yes, the materially poor are among them, but this is not primarily a social class. In fact, he says this is a theological principle and not a social principle. The poor also, Francis says, save us. Salvation, he wrote, came to us from the yes uttered by the lowly maiden from a small town on the fringes of an empire. The Savior was born in a manger in the midst of animals like children of poor families. And the new evangelization, he says, is an invitation to acknowledge the saving power at work in the lives of the poor and to put them at the center of the church's pilgrim path. That is very challenging. I find myself very, very challenged by Francis's directives to the church. They make me uncomfortable because they're things that I don't ordinarily have to deal with or do. But that's good. Francis, above all, has given us a personal example, and he does things spontaneously. He doesn't need to be told. The first things we heard about him after his election were that he got on a bus the next day, rode across town to pay his hotel bill, wearing a simple black cassock. We knew that he moved his residence from the papal apartments in the Vatican to the residence, the Domus Sanctae Marthae, which is a very, very simple residence. Anyone who's ever been in there or stayed there, very well known for its very thin walls. You can basically hear the person snoring in the room next to you. And he says, above all, and this action of his comes above all from his belief that God loves the poor in a special way. And the reason that there is a preferential option for the poor in the church because we want to imitate God. God shows the poor his first mercy, Francis says. This divine preference has consequences for the faith life of all Christians, since we are all called to have the mind which was in Christ Jesus. This is what Francis has been preaching and what Francis has been living. He goes out to the homeless in Rome. He goes out in a simple coat when he is able to sneak by the Swiss guards, and he literally has conversations under bridges with the homeless in Rome. He continues to do that. He considers it important to his papacy and important to his priesthood. And this is something that gives us a whole different view of the way that this principle is meant to be embraced and to be lived. Be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful. Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not be condemned and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for that personal and and very engaging piece. You should lose your talk more often. We can only hope that Michael Baxter has lost his talk as well.
Right. I'm sorry to break it to you, but I have mine prepared, although I did lose some on Sunday. Some respects, I think I'll be picking up with some of the themes that you concluded with. Shortly after his election, Pope Francis said that he would like a church that is poor and for the poor. He has repeated and acted on this desiderata in many ways in the year and a half since, in his informal statements, in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudae, in his choice to live in simpler quarters and eat in more communal settings, in his urging of bishops, priests, and laity alike to avoid conspicuous consumption and live simpler lives. Furthermore, he has launched an aggressive critique of capitalism, describing it as an economic system and a corresponding set of values that promotes gross inequalities and excludes the poor from even the most basic things of life and well-being. For this unswerving critique, he has received scorn from the defenders of neoliberalism, a set of ideas holding that economic production and consumption best serves human needs when markets are free of government regulation and intervention. Given the Pope's critique of capitalism, coupled with the call for a church that is poor and for the poor, the question arises, what are we waiting for? In my remarks this afternoon, I take this to be the social question of our time, and I would like to suggest 3 reasons why we Catholics and others of goodwill are not moving in the direction indicated by Pope Francis. First, it is because we think that poverty is inevitable. People are born with different abilities, talents, and gifts, and they are born into different social circumstances. Inequality is unavoidable. Infant mortality, malnutrition, lack of proper food, clothing, housing, medical care, employment, and education are certainly dire human problems that must be combated. But since its emergence in the early modern period, capitalism has proven to be the best economic system available in solving these problems, or at least in making progress towards solutions. This should not be surprising, for capitalism rests on a basic truth of human existence, many of us think. People are self-interested, and it is in pursuing their own interests that they are most likely to channel their hard work and human ingenuity into business enterprises that provide goods and services to others. So in the long run, when market dynamics are allowed to operate in relative freedom from government interference, production is harnessed to meet human needs. Although it is true that capitalism has generated steep levels of economic inequality, it is also true that this wealth benefits everyone as it is reinvested to expand existing production or to search for new and untapped ventures which will in turn generate more goods and services for the benefit of all. When it comes to increasing profits and wealth, all boats on the lake rise, or to use another analogy, wealth trickles down to everyone. Nowadays, all neoliberal economists, or almost all, concede that some government regulation may be necessary for the healthy working of markets in the form of health and safety laws, antitrust laws, laws to curb abuses in financing and investment banking. Still, in this vision of economic life, we can trace the lineaments of Adam Smith's belief that an invisible hand guides the working of the free market, the hand of progress when cast in secular terms, or when cast in theological terms, the hand of providence. To this vision of economic life, Pope Francis has responded with a resounding no. No to an economy of exclusion. I'm quoting from the subheadings of Evangelii Gaudium. No to the new idolatry of money. No to a financial system which rules rather than serves. No to the inequality which spawns violence. The Pope decries any and all instances in which human beings are excluded, discarded, cast out as leftovers. In this context, he writes, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth, encouraged by a free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. These are sharp words for neoliberal theories and theorists, but in voicing them, Francis is reiterating a long-standing critique advanced by his predecessors, Popes Benedict XVI in Caritatis in Veritate, John Paul II in Centesimus Annus, Paul VI in Populorum Progressio, John XXIII in Mater Magistra, Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, and Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum. In short, he is reiterating a critique of neoliberalism advanced in papal encyclicals since the Church began addressing the social question. In the 19th century, the social question arose in response to the onset of industrial capitalism in Europe and its brutal effects on the working classes. In Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII condemned communism and socialism, but he also condemned the notion that free markets should operate with no interference or intervention on the part of the state. Rather, the state, as an institution founded by God, has the right and duty to shape society in accord with the precepts of the natural law. This brings up a second reason why we are not moving in the direction set forth by Pope Francis, the direction of being a poor church for the poor. It is because our efforts for the poor have been and continue to be directed to the mechanisms of the state. The central actor in this regard in the United States was Monsignor John A. Ryan, who in effect brought Rerum Novarum to the U.S., first as a social philosopher at Catholic University, then as the director of the Social Action Department of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. In the decades after World War I, Ryan worked for legislation that protected workers, laws requiring a minimum wage, the 8-hour day, worker compensation for on-the-job injuries, a prohibition on child labor, and so on. After World War II, the efforts of the NCWC for legislative reform continued, bolstered by papal encyclicals and Vatican II statements, especially Gaudium et Spes. And in 1986, the U.S. Catholic bishops produced their own document, Economic Justice for All, grounding their approach to economics in scripture and tradition and centering it on the dignity of the human person. They identify ethical norms for economic life, love and solidarity, justice and participation, against marginalization, and they apply them to policy issues such as employment, poverty, food and agriculture, and the global economy. In this context, they write of, quote, a new American experiment marked not by competition but by cooperation within firms and industries and among different regions nationally and internationally. And they call on Catholics to spark progress toward this vision by responding to Christ's call to conversion in vocation, in worship and prayer, in holiness in the world, in leisure, in an overall commitment to the kingdom of justice and love. Love implies concern for all, the bishops conclude, especially the poor, and a continued search for those social and economic structures that permit everyone to share in a community that is part of a redeemed creation. This pastoral letter typifies Catholic efforts in the United States for the poor over the past century. Today, those who want to extend these efforts understandably see their efforts as fully aligned with Pope Francis's call for a church that is for the poor. But this state-centered reformist approach on social teaching is fraught with difficulties that have plagued it in the past. For one thing, this vision is marked by an idealism that is bound to prove ineffective in the face of economic realities it seeks to alter. Moral suasion, civic duty, cooperation over competition, participation of the excluded, and abiding regard for the least among us, these all have a place in economic life, especially for Christians. But it's another matter to what extent these virtues and practices can generate a far-reaching transformation of the market forces shaping production and consumption in the advanced capitalist economies of the 21st century. There are limits to what can be changed in economic life in the United States, as has been painfully demonstrated in the 30 years since the American Catholic bishops called for these ambitious reforms. For another thing, there has been formidable opposition to this state intervention approach, not only from those outside the church, but from those within the church. John Ryan and his associates had their Catholic critics who dubbed him the Right Reverend New Dealer. But it was during the period of the post-World War II prosperity, when Catholics moved in greater numbers into the upper classes, that some of them saw the economy as providing plenty of equal opportunity to those with the wit, wisdom, and work ethic to take advantage of it. Moreover, the post-World War II era was also the Cold War era, when state regulation of the market was seen as a kind of creeping crypto-communism or soft totalitarianism. The most notable critic on this score among Catholics was William F. Buckley, who in 1955 gathered a cadre of like-minded critics to run National Review, which quickly became an effective voice for conservative causes in this nation, including the free market. In 1961, he made clear his view on Catholic social teaching regarding state intervention in the market when, shortly after the release of John the 23rd's encyclical Mater et Magistra, he ran an editorial entitled Mater Si, Magistra No. Years of argument ensued in the Catholic press, complete with invocations to the by now familiar distinction between doctrinally affirmed principles and the application of those principles through prudential judgment. This debate continued in the 60s and 70s and crystallized in the 80s as the bishops prepared to release economic justice for all, when the National Review crowd sponsored a counter-pastoral letter authored by Michael Novak, titled Toward the Future, Catholic Social Thought in the U.S. Economy. Novak argued for a Catholic version of neoliberal economics, extolling the virtues of capitalism and the free market and decrying state interventionism. 5 years later, Novak extended this argument into the Catholic ethic and the spirit of Catholicism, and the spirit of capitalism, insisting that Weber's view on the congruence of capitalism and the Protestant ethic applies to Catholicism as well, indeed better. Organizations such as Legatus and the Acton Institute fall into this trajectory. For those who oppose these efforts and invoke the authority of Catholic social teaching as their authority, the most daunting and decisive rebuttal is that the obligations of interior assent to Catholic teaching on doctrinal matters do not apply when applying the principles of the natural law to contingent matters of economic policy. And this rebuttal is, much to the chagrin of the proponents of state interventionism, philosophically and theologically well-founded. They are matters of prudential judgment. That's a problem. And then, beyond the economic reality problem and the prudential judgment problem, there is the political problem, which is this. Political efforts to elect people and implement policies regulating the market and providing relief to the marginalized often run in sharp conflict with pro-life politics. The almost resistible absorption of Catholics into the mainstream U.S. political culture in the past 50 years has resulted in the untenable division between so-called social justice Catholics and pro-life Catholics, as if more than 1 million abortions each year is not a social justice issue, or 1/5 of children in poverty in this country living in poverty is not a life issue. These are false alternatives created by deformities in U.S. electoral politics. And it is good when Catholics resist this trend by casting both pro-life and economic concerns in the language of human dignity and the common good, and decrying the individualism of both neoliberal economics and pro-choice politics. But political elites and operatives in both parties have a deep stake in maintaining the allegiance of Catholics because their numbers are so large, particularly in many swing states. Those working to reform the economy, therefore, feel compelled to invest large amounts of time and energy and a scandalous amount of money in order to win primaries, put the right candidates in office, lobby them once they do take office, and prepare for the next round of elections. When it comes to reforming the economy, real and lasting political effectiveness is difficult to achieve. Meanwhile, as Pope Francis writes, the excluded are still waiting. None of these problems, the economic realities problem, the prudential judgment problem, or the partisan politics problem, necessarily invalidates the state-centered reformist approach to Catholic teaching on economics, not in principle at least. But taken together, these problems generate insuperable obstacles for Catholics seeking to reform U.S. economic life by means of state intervention. And they should be the occasion for us to re-examine our assumptions and perhaps consider another approach. And the first assumption we should re-examine is the idea that the state and the market exist as two separate entities, rather than a single, complex, well-integrated network of political and economic forces, one that is more accurately described as the state and the market, which functions as the originator and maker of law in our society, or better yet, the originator and protector of lawlessness in our society. This is how Alistair McIntyre describes it in his essay, How Aristotelianism Can Become Revolutionary. And as the title indicates, he argues that this state and market complex is best dealt with by returning to the kind of practical reasoning embodied in a Thomistic Aristotelian tradition of moral inquiry. This is what he did yesterday. This is not the place to rehearse McIntyre's argument in After Virtue, well known to many here, but it is important to note, in relation to what I have said up to this point, that his argument does not renounce but extends his earlier Marxist critique of the free market and the modern state as corrosive of any effort to build genuine communities that embody an economics and politics of the common good. The virtuous life in this understanding entails resisting the dynamics of the free market and the heavy arms of the modern state. Or better yet, to reverse the terms, the economics of the free market and the politics of the modern state resists forms of life that promote the development of virtuous practices. Reversing the terms like this places the moral agency where it belongs, in the ambit of local communities where people performing virtuous practices learn that their personal good can be attained only in and through their pursuit of the common good, which is determined through the practical reasoning and shared deliberation of these local communities. Here we have a different response to the social question, one that refuses faith either in the magical workings of the neoliberal free market or the reformist policies of the modern state, an alternative that points to the possibility of a distributist economics combined with a localist politics. McIntyre offers examples of this alternative: groups of musicians and research scientists, fishing and farming communities, trade unions and worker co-ops, small businesses and neighborhood organizations, local schools and small colleges. But the question still remains, to what extent is this alternative really possible? And this brings up the third reason why we tend not to move in the direction indicated by Pope Francis. We don't think it is really possible to be a church for the poor. And with good reason. Most of us are educated, literate. We know how to solve problems. We have marketable skills. Most of us are relatively wealthy, in the top third of the nation as regards income level, or in the top quarter, the top quintile, the top tenth, and some of us in the top 1%. And these percentages pertain to the United States. In the context of the global economy, we are all wealthy. If we do not feel wealthy, it is often because we have taken on debt to pay for college or advanced degrees in law, medicine, business, or academia, for houses, cars, and college funds for our children. As a result, we cannot afford to be poor. So it seems ironically, due to a variety of factors not within our control, being poor is out of reach to us. It is impossible. Moreover, we are not sure we want to be poor, for being poor is a grueling, depressing reality. The anxiety, the insecurity, the suffering for want of normal material goods, the sense of failure for not being able to provide for your loved ones. No one should have to endure it, and no one should want to endure it. But Jesus calls us to be poor, voluntarily at least. And this wisdom of Scripture and tradition, and the wisdom of Scripture and tradition is that, as Michael Garvey once put, the pursuit of wealth is a flight from God. In light of this wisdom and in light of MacIntyre's diagnosis of the state and market complex and his account of practice-based community, we should consider that we have an alternative in the vision of an eccentric yet insightful thinker who has pointed out to us a way to be for the poor by being with the poor, or at least being near the poor, in community with the poor, making a life together, building a new society within the shell of the old, as he put it, a society where it is easier to be good. I refer to Peter Morin, co-founder of the Catholic Worker, along with his more famous comrade, Dorothy Day. As Peter Morin saw it, with an intellectual vision not unlike MacIntyre's, the modern world is in crisis, owing to the marginalization of religion, the disintegration of metaphysics, the onset of material atheism, the domination of modern life by the economics of capitalist markets and the politics of the nation-state. This reading of modernity was standard fare among Catholic thinkers of Peter Morin's time, let us say from the 20s until the 40s. And like many, he too cited such leading intellectual lights as Charles Péguy, Christopher Dawson, and Jacques Maritain. But he parted company from many Catholic intellectuals by drawing on an edgier, more radical set of thinkers, the English distributists and anti-statists, G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, the Russian anarchist personalists Peter Kropotkin and Nikolai Berdyaev, and the French personalist Emmanuel Mounier. These thinkers provided a lens through which Morin could view the economics and politics in terms of an Aristotelian Thomistic concept of the common good, yet in a localist, distributist, non-state-centered way that ran counter to the Catholic scholars generally envisioning at that time. Thus, Morin agreed with John Ryan that the rights of the poor and working classes need to be protected. But this was not enough. They need purposeful work that exercises their full capacities. They need co-workers rather than competitors. They need community. Ryan did not address the social question at its roots, according to Morin. Legislative reform is not radical enough. By contrast, Peter Morin, drawing on R.H. Tawney's books, The Acquisitive Society and Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, saw the basis for social reconstruction in the ancient and medieval past, when work involved true craftsmanship, when people cultivated their own land for food, when goods were attained not just with money, but by sharing and trading, when tools and machines were acquired not to maximize returns on investments, but to serve local common needs, when lending money was a favor, not a means of making money. All this is articulated in Peter Morin's easy essays, which were designed to get important ideas across to ordinary people. The world would be better off if people tried to become better. And people would become better if they stopped trying to be better off. And so on. Not surprisingly, Peter Morin was dismissed often as a utopian. This in spite of his very practical three-pronged program for social reconstruction: houses of hospitality, regular meetings for the clarification of thought, and agrarian communities. This isn't the time to discuss the practical aspects of developing houses of hospitality and farming communities, except to say that these practical aspects give the community's clarification of thought the quality of practical reasoning about the challenges people face because they live in poverty, about how to break out of the work and spend cycle, about how to pay down debt, about how people can how people out of work can get and keep a job, about how a community could start a small business, a day labor service, a scrap metal, a furniture repair shop, about how to grow food and build houses and live on the land. In doing so, the community will be deliberating about how to pursue the good of each member and the common good, which are intrinsically linked. In this process, they learn to set aside what they thought were their self-interests, but which were actually expressions of self-protection and acquisitiveness, and then to take on others' interests as their own. The community members get transformed so that they can realistically live out a way of life that would not have been possible prior to their transformation, which is still underway. But it becomes possible in and through that transformation. This is a slow, gradual learning process, but at length it becomes realistic to think about economics, an economic order in which people stop trying to be better off and instead try to be better. Possibilities open up. We no longer need appeal only to the past. We see the Acts of the Apostles not as a closed book. We can point to it here and now. People are really living like this. In this sense, Peter Morin may have been a utopian, but not, to paraphrase MacIntyre, a utopian of the future, the providential workings of the magical market, the promise of the benevolent state, the excluded still waiting. Rather, Peter Morin was a utopian of the present. What the Catholic worker teaches us is to see that the range of present possibilities is greater than what seems to be allowed by the established economic and political order. The extent to which we think and feel that such alternative, local, practice-based communities are not possible, or simply not significant, is the extent to which we need to have our imaginations transformed. There is much that resists such a transformation, often in the form of false wisdom. This is the vocation to be with the poor. This is a vocation for a few. Or, you can't live with the poor if you have a family with children. Or, you can get more done with the stroke of the legislative pen. Or, people are by nature self-interested. It is a crucial task for scholars to expose these pieces of false wisdom for what they are: forms of ideology that deceive us into thinking that the dominant economic and political order is normal, natural, the way things are, the way things must be. And the best way for scholars to perform this task is to live with or near the poor, with or near workers, especially low-wage workers. To be what Antonio Gramsci called organic intellectuals. To be in communities of, in Peter Morin's vision, scholars and workers. And thus to be capable of resisting what Lenin called the tyranny of established facts, and capable of refusing to bow down before the conventional wisdom on how to get things done. In recent months, there has been talk of Catholics in the United States taking up the Benedictine option, an obvious reference to the closing paragraphs of After Virtue, where MacIntyre writes, we are waiting for another, doubtless very different St. Benedict. Others have voiced preference for the Dominican option. Dorothy Day thought Peter Morin was a modern-day St. Francis, so I suppose he represents the Franciscan option. We get all these options. But it's a mistake to over-theorize these matters by claiming one model over the other. This is how academics stay in business. It's how we make money. The social question in the time of Pope Francis is, what are we waiting for? And the answer is, we're waiting for ourselves. The point is to begin, in which case we should not have to be waiting for long. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I see you put your 7-month-old son to sleep, but made everyone else in the room move forward on their seat in terror, as you said, as Michael Garvey once said.
Yeah, right.
We now have time for 15 minutes of questions and answers. Could we take a number of questions, maybe 3 questions from the floor, so that we can get both members of the panel engaged? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question, which is, I want to offer kind of in the spirit of a devil's advocate a little bit. So if I understand, I think some real point of agreement between both of those fine reflections is that the social teaching of the church does represent kind of a distinct science, to borrow a term from the first talk, something added upon, and it not just kind of restating things from the tradition, but a new thing, this preferential option and various other things. Okay, so that's the first point. And the second point is, I think there's also a claim to be made about a more fundamental thing, more fundamental in Catholic social doctrine than the preferential option for the poor, which is kind of this radical, if we just kind of borrow from Alistair, idea that virtue, the life of virtue and conversion of the heart is kind of the key way to social reform. So getting the thinking right about preferential option for the poor and the policies either from the left and the right, getting the thinking right is not the main thing, but getting the heart right, so being better and not being better off. So my devil's advocate question, just to hear what you think about it, is kind of if the church talks so much about getting the thinking right in the social matters, about the poor and other things, does she herself risk kind of throwing people off the scent from the primary thing, which is conversion of heart? Does she herself risk seeming a little bit materialistic?
I'm not sure I got the last question. The last part of that is that the conversion of the heart is the primary thing and not the material.
So, yeah, I think the claim I would want to make is that there's a more fundamental thing right behind the preferential option for the poor in Catholic social thought, which I think was sort of expressed best in a certain sense at Vatican II. The kind of the reform of morals, the correction of morals, the reform of the heart, conversion of the heart has to be the vocation to be better and not to be better off, which then conversion of the heart takes place, and then through that you have social change. You really don't get social change without that. But when she talks so much about kind of these prudential things, which are about getting the thinking right, the policies right and the thinking right, does the church herself possibly risk throwing people off of the scent of how we think social change takes place?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
going to really be in response to what you're saying or a helpful response. But one is I'm a little suspicious of the idea of the heart precedes action. I think the action, I think in the Aristotelian notion that actions shape the heart too. And another thing I'll say, which I think we all need to think about, is when we say there's something more fundamental than, say, material needs. Yeah. That's said by people who have those material needs met when there are people that aren't getting those needs met. There's been 120 people in this world who died of starvation since we started giving our papers. That's a problem. I think we can agree. And although you're right, that should hit our hearts. And I think you're right that should change, our actions. And if we get into all these policy issues, I think that might be a problem. And I guess I'd say, but that should move us, not just our hearts, but move our feet in a certain direction. I think this is what Francis wants. He talks about the smell. He wants us to be close, because then we start seeing things that we don't see when we're in our pious moments of thinking the most important thing is how I feel about God. And that's not important at all when it comes to people living in injustice like this.
I appreciate the question. I think that particularly we're talking mostly about Francis right now. While it's true that he does get into very specific questions of reforming of structures, I think his major impetus all along the way is to get people on the streets. He wants people moving and changing and doing things. And I think that he throws out a lot of ideas because people are engaged in different areas, and he's writing to the universal church and beyond, which is not just people in this room, it's everyone. And he's giving ideas. Some will be more applicable to some, and some will be more applicable to others. And each one of us in our own lives has to find that area where God is challenging us to live more. But he's trying to do it in a direction so that all of us, from wherever we are moving in a concerted way in that direction, even if we're not doing necessarily the same things about it. And I think that is why those ideas are also important, because they do kind of unify that effort in a direction.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi. I'd like to challenge the idea that we should drop everything and all do the same thing to serve the poor, because I think we all have different missions and how to accomplish this, whether it's by actually being on the street and helping the poor, or writing about it. I mean, do we expect Alistair McIntyre to stop being an academic and teaching us about what it means to serve the poor in order for him to go out there? And then the other point I wanted to make was more about being poor in spirit. And I think we need to talk about spiritual poverty because, as Mother Teresa said, you can fill the stomach, but people are still lonely. And that doesn't mean it's just serving the materially poor. People who are the wealthiest are probably the loneliest too. And so I think that we have different missions to different groups of people. And some people are called to catechize and evangelize people who may be materially rich but really spiritually poor. And so maybe if you can talk about our various functions in the church and serving in different ways to bring about the kingdom of Christ to people who are materially poor and also spiritually poor.
I know you're going to have good things to say about this too. But I was thinking, this is a great question, because I was thinking in my head about Alistair in my hotel room as I was typing out the closing of this. And my computer didn't crash, fortunately. And I'll tell you what I said in my head, okay? I said, all right, we all should be organic intellectuals. It's a term from Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist. And he said, intellectuals need to be close to the poor and the workers in order to understand their problems, because it's only from there that you'll get it right. And I think that's a helpful point. And that's what I'm pushing toward. And I thought, okay, but Alistair McIntyre, he writes these books that my papers are just footnotes on. And so should he go? Yeah, and I thought, no, in a few cases there are people that are exceptional and they can stay and just write as much as they can. But most of us aren't like that. And so we need to be closer, because it's closer to the poor. Because it's the best way to become better. I want to say that. Better scholars in the sense that so much of our theories have nothing to say to what's going on in the world. And I've spent a good part of my life doing scholarship, so I don't want to say that scholarship is not worthwhile, but it needs to be pressed in a certain direction. Now, we all believe this as Catholics anyway. You know, we're not objective people in the modern sense. We believe that it's a matter of faith to have a certain perspective and to explore that. And I think what I'm trying to say, and I think what McIntyre is trying to say in a different way, and what Francis is trying to say, is part of our faith is to relocate our reflection so that the practical reasoning, which is essential to attaining justice in this world, will take on more important things than whether a new building ought to be 5 stories or 4 stories, but no one ever thinks of putting a soup kitchen on the bottom floor here at Notre Dame. And so this is the kind of critique he wants. That's why he's down on bishops that are just spending millions of dollars on their bathtubs and stuff like this. It's an utter scandal, and the gospel warns us about that. I dare say more than anything. More than anything. So I think you're right. We all have charisms, and I live in the suburbs, but maybe I should bring refugees from Iraq, Mosul, or from the border to live in the next block. Get 20 couples to put in $100 a month and pay a mortgage on a house and to take them in. That's what I'm saying, that if we have the imagination, we can be who we are and not have to turn into Mother Teresa. But we can do, this is important, remarkable, world historically important things if we have the imagination.
I subscribe to everything that Professor Baxter just said. Clearly, we all have different vocations and charisms, and clearly God does not expect the same thing from all of us. In terms of specifically where we do what we do and how we do what we do, but doing certain things is expected of all of us. And I think that regardless of the particular vocation or particular state, these appeals are to the heart of every single one of us, and there are ways, if we're honest, that each one of us can apply them. Sometimes some will feel that that's a call to a more radical change of lifestyle. It could be. Many will find that there are ways to just live in a more concerted way that principle in their daily life to start with as it is. And sometimes also the Holy Spirit works by stages where you respond to one thing and then you realize that there are bigger and bigger things that you could be doing because you said yes in a little thing and all of a sudden you find that he's asking for more. So I think that it is personal. But at the same time, one of the roles of the Pope is to give marching orders in a direction, is to set a tone for all of us to have an idea that this is kind of where, this is what the Spirit is saying to the churches, to quote the book of Revelation. This is, and the Holy Father helps us to get that. And I think to ignore it and just business as usual would be a failure to take advantage of that gift, which is for our church right now. You know, it's true what you say, and Jesus did not say to every person he met, go sell all you own, give the money to the poor and follow me. Go sell your own. He said that to one person, right? That was a specific calling. Not everyone is called to that, and you can't say, and I maybe to expand on that, it's not just Alistair McIntyre that probably doesn't have that. Most of us probably don't have that very specific vocation. But all of us, starting with myself, I see many ways every day when I can serve the poor, and the poor, again, in a broader understanding of the needy around me, if I am less selfish, if I am less focused on what I'm doing, if, like the Good Samaritan, instead of going about my business and doing what I'm doing, I notice the needs of those around me, I can do a lot more every day than I do. And that is conversion of heart, by the way. I mean, that is something that really is about changing the way you are. And it goes back to, and I'm going to finish with this, I'm talking too much, but what we were talking about Catholic social doctrine, the family before, much of the problem is that it's relatively easy to care for example, a handicapped member of the family. It's much harder for us to take a Christian vision where I see someone on the street and that is my brother, and that is my sister, and to really take on a Christ-like vision that person, I should be helping that person up to, as much as I am able, as if that person were in my family. Right? So, those are some thoughts.
Thank you, Father.
I know we're late on time, but just real briefly, years ago, my parents used to tell me, eat your dinner because there's starving kids in China and India. Both these countries are now second and third largest economies in the world. And they got their problems, but they have succeeded in raising really hundreds of millions of people from poverty into a higher level. Can you say something about their method? Neither country is Christian. How did they succeed in no longer being a
China
symbol?
and which was the other?
China and India.
And India. Do you want to do that first or you want me to go first? No, go ahead. This is a common topic of conversation and reflection. There's no doubt that China, especially in terms of its gross production, is doing much better, but both of the countries are, than they were. Neither one has a Christian underpinning in its consciousness and you see real problems from that. You do realize how certain things you can get away with, if you will, in a country that is Christian in its foundations and one that is not. And the abuses, of which we only know a very small fraction, that occur in these countries are, they make Dickens's critique of the Industrial Revolution in Britain to be child's play. I mean, they're really serious things. And I think that it emphasizes the need for what Paul VI called this integral human development, in the sense that simply improving your state economically does not guarantee a better life, right? And it doesn't respond to the deeper needs of the human person. It's a good thing. It's definitely better to progress economically than to go backwards. But it's radically insufficient. And I think that this holds up the sense of where Christians have such an immense role to play in economic life, in political life, and in the culture of these countries too. And that's why missionaries, along with bringing the gospel, are bringing a way of understanding who the human person is and what society is meant to be that's essential for these countries.
I'll give a brief response. That's a good question. Although I guess I'd want to say that those economies are not isolated from other economies. And one of the reasons the Chinese economy is doing so well, I think, not being an economist, but I'm going to pretend I am for a minute, is because they have so many amazing expanding markets in the United States. So that if we tonight take off or whatever we have on, it's probably going to say made in some of these places. And it's going to have been made for 25 cents an hour by some Vietnamese girl who is probably not going to be able to make it like that and go and have to move into the sex trade or something. You know what I mean? And that, in that sense, these expanding markets are remarkable and impressive. Maybe the way Robert E. Lee found war to be impressive. And yet, people are getting destroyed economically. And we're supposed to be uncomfortable with the fact that we seem to be beneficiaries of this. And that's why I think we need to be conscious of the other end of our clothes and of our food. And not to be guilt-ridden about it, but to think, if this is really, really a problem, we've got to do something about it. And you know what? You can do something about it. You can respond in a way that you'll find not only more obligations put on you, you'll find that you love living this way, because we love the incarnation, because we have goodness in us and we flourish when we're good. Anyway, end of sermon.
If you were wondering why you were walking into a dark auditorium on this beautiful fall afternoon, now you know why. That was wonderful. Thank you, both of you.